The stench of scorched metal and alien chemicals hung thick in the air over Xylos. What was once a lush landscape of vibrant fungal forests and crystalline rock formations had been reduced to a charred battlefield. The recent clash between the Terran Alliance and the Vexori Empire had torn through this sector like a tempest of fire and death, leaving only destruction in its wake. Corporal Kale pressed himself deeper into the shadows of the ruined Vexori structure, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his wounded leg. The Vexori blade that had caught him during the retreat had left a nasty gash that ran from knee to ankle. It wasn't just the depth of the wound that concerned him, but the characteristic bluish tinge around its edges, the telltale sign of Vexori biological contaminants beginning to take hold. Kale had been separated from his unit during the final push when a Vexori counterattack had scattered the Terran forces. His communications equipment had been damaged beyond repair when he'd taken a fall down a ravine while evading enemy scouts. Now, with limited supplies, a worsening wound, and no way to call for extraction, he was effectively stranded in enemy territory. The battlefield had fallen eerily silent. No distant sounds of weapons fire, no scream of engines from aerial units, no shouted commands or cries of the wounded. Just the soft hiss of burning materials and the occasional crack of cooling metal. The silence was almost more terrifying than the battle itself. It meant either total victory or total defeat. Given that Kale was alone and injured, he feared the latter. He took inventory of his supplies. Half a canteen of water, 3 emergency ration packs, a basic field medical kit with barely enough antibiotics to stave off standard infections, let alone Vexori bioweapons, and his sidearm with 2 energy cells remaining. Not enough to survive long, and certainly not enough to fight his way back to friendly lines. As Kale shifted his position to check his wound, a faint sound caught his attention, a groan, distinctly non-human but unmistakably one of pain. Cautiously, he eased himself up and peered over the rubble that had been his shelter. Approximately 20 meters away, beneath a collapsed section of what must have been a ceremonial arch, lay a figure half buried in debris. Even from this distance, Kale could see the ornate, now damaged armor that marked a high-ranking Vexori. But it wasn't until he saw the distinctive neural crown, albeit partially crushed, that his blood ran cold. The matriarch, Lyra, the queen of the Vexori Empire herself, was lying wounded and trapped less than a stone's throw away. Every instinct screamed at him. Standing orders were crystal clear. High-value Vexori targets were to be eliminated on sight, particularly the matriarch, whose psychic abilities were said to be strong enough to corrupt human minds with prolonged exposure. Training and hatred both urged him to draw his weapon and end her, a clean shot to finish what the battle had started. Kale's hand moved to his sidearm, fingers wrapping around the grip. One shot, one high-value enemy eliminated. A significant blow to the Vexori leadership structure and a victory for the Alliance, even if he didn't survive to report it. But as he raised his weapon, he saw the matriarch stir. She wasn't just wounded, she was suffering. Her slender, almost translucent hand reached out, clutching weakly at the rubble pinning her lower body. The proud, fearsome leader of the species that had killed so many of his friends, his brothers and sisters in arms, was reduced to a helpless, pain-racked being. His finger hesitated on the trigger. Kale had killed many Vexori during his 3 tours of duty on the frontier worlds. He'd watched his homeworld colony burn under their assault when he was just a teenager. He'd seen the aftermath of their bioweapons on civilian populations. But he had never executed a defenseless enemy, wounded and trapped. Damn it all, he muttered, holstering his weapon. Perhaps it was weakness. Perhaps it was the last shred of humanity the war hadn't stripped from him. But he couldn't do it. Not like this. Decision made, Kale limped toward the trapped matriarch, every step sending spikes of pain up his leg. As he drew closer, he could see the full extent of her injuries. The Vexori royal's normally iridescent skin had dulled to an ashen blue-gray. Purple blood seeped from multiple lacerations, and her breathing came in labored, rattling gasps. Working quickly, ignoring both the pain in his leg and the voice in his head screaming about the insanity of his actions. Kale began to clear the debris trapping the Vexori Queen. The work was arduous, each movement tearing at his wound, but piece by piece, he managed to free her from the wreckage. As the last piece of debris was removed, the matriarch's eyes snapped open, all three of them, the central one glowing with a faint, pulsating light. She stared at Kale with an expression that transcended species barriers, pure contempt. "Kill me, Terran," she hissed in accented standard, her voice a complex harmony of tones that sent an involuntary shiver down Kale's spine. "Complete your desecration." Kale ignored her, instead focusing on assessing her injuries. The ornate armor had protected her from the worst of the collapse, but she had a severe fracture in one of her lower limbs and what appeared to be significant internal bleeding, judging by the purple fluid seeping from her mouth. "Not going to kill you," he said tersely, reaching for his medical kit. "Not today." The matriarch's three eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What game is this? What new torture does your kind devise?" Again, Kale didn't respond. He administered a universal coagulant from his kit, one of the few medications proven effective on both human and Vexori physiology, and fashioned a crude splint for her fractured limb using debris and strips torn from his own undershirt. As he worked, a cold reality settled over him. They couldn't stay here. Scavengers would be drawn to the battlefield soon, both the local wildlife and the less savory elements that followed in the wake of war. More importantly, if either Terran cleanup crews or Vexori recovery forces arrived, his decision to aid the enemy queen would result in his immediate execution, or worse. There was only one slim hope for survival. An abandoned Terran outpost lay approximately 25 miles to the north. If it hadn't been completely stripped by retreating forces or opportunistic looters, it might still contain a functional long-range communicator, medical supplies, or at the very least better shelter. The journey would be hellish. The terrain between their current position and the outpost was some of the most treacherous on Xylos. Toxic fungal forests, acid marshes, wind-carved canyons with unpredictable microclimate shifts. And he would have to carry or support the matriarch the entire way, with his own wound steadily worsening. It was almost certainly suicide, but staying was certain death. "We need to move," he told the matriarch, who had been silently watching him with those unnerving, three-eyed stare. "Can you stand?" She attempted to rise, but immediately collapsed with a hiss of pain. "My internal injuries are significant," she admitted reluctantly. Kale nodded grimly, as he had expected, with a grunt of effort that sent fresh blood seeping through the bandage on his leg. He carefully lifted the Vexori Royal. She was lighter than a human of comparable size would be. The Vexori evolved on a lower gravity world, but the ornate armor she wore more than made up the difference. "If you try to kill me, Terran, I will ensure your death is slow, even with my last breath," the matriarch warned as he adjusted his grip. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already," Kale replied flatly. "Save your strength. We got a long way to go." The first mile was the hardest. Every step was agony for Kale, his wounded leg threatening to buckle with each footfall. The matriarch remained tense in his arms, her breath coming in sharp, pained gasps whenever he jostled her too much. Neither spoke beyond the occasional terse direction or warning about the terrain. The battlefield gradually gave way to the outer reaches of a fungal forest, one of the distinctive features of Xylos. Towering mushroom-like structures in vivid purples, blues, and sickly greens created a canopy overhead. The air grew thick with spores that glittered in the dying light of the planet's primary sun, beautiful and deadly. "The red spores," the matriarch said suddenly as they entered the forest proper. "Avoid them. They cause hallucinations in your species. Fatal ones." Kale glanced at her suspiciously, wondering if this was some trick to lead him into greater danger. But her eyes were fixed ahead, her expression grim but not deceitful. "And the blue ones?" he asked, noting a particularly dense cloud of azure particles drifting on the breeze. "Respiratory irritant, but not lethal to either of us," she replied. "The green are harmless. The yellow will burn your skin." With the matriarch's grudging guidance, Kale navigated through the fungal forest, carefully choosing their path to avoid the worst of the spore clouds. The alien queen remained largely silent otherwise, conserving her strength or perhaps simply unwilling to engage more than necessary with her enemy. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the light dimmed, creating an eerie twilight beneath the fungal canopy. Bioluminescent patches on the trunks of the larger specimens provided just enough illumination to navigate by, casting everything in an otherworldly blue-green glow. The relative quiet was shattered by a sudden, skittering sound. Kale froze, carefully lowering the matriarch against the base of a massive fungal trunk before drawing his sidearm. "Scuttlers," the matriarch whispered. "They hunt by scent and sound. Blood draws them." As if on cue, a pack of low-slung, many-legged creatures emerged from the undergrowth. They resembled nothing so much as giant centipedes with too many eyes and mandibles that clicked incessantly. Their carapaces reflected the bioluminescent light, making them appear to shimmer as they moved. "How many shots do you have?" the matriarch asked quietly. "Not enough," Kale replied, counting at least 7 of the creatures circling them now. "They fear fire and loud sounds." Kale thought quickly. "I have 2 energy cells. If I overload one..." The matriarch nodded in understanding. "It will explode. Potentially effective." Working quickly, Kale removed one of his 2 remaining energy cells from his sidearm. Using the small toolkit in his belt pouch, he bypassed the safety mechanism and initiated an overload sequence. The cell began to hum and glow with increasing intensity. "Cover your hearing organs," he warned the matriarch, before hurling the cell as far as he could into the forest, away from their planned route. The explosion was more impressive than he'd expected. A burst of blue-white energy that momentarily turned night to day in the fungal forest. The shockwave flattened the smaller fungi and sent the scuttlers fleeing in blind panic, their many legs carrying them rapidly away from the perceived threat. "Effective," the matriarch observed, a note of reluctant respect in her harmonized voice. "But now we're down to 1 energy cell," Kale replied grimly, helping her back up into his arms. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his infected leg. He could feel the fever beginning now, the Vexori contaminants spreading through his bloodstream despite the antibiotics he'd taken. They continued through the forest, the going becoming increasingly difficult as Kale's strength ebbed. The weight of the matriarch, light as she was, began to feel like a crushing burden. His vision occasionally blurred, and more than once he stumbled, causing them both pain. "You are fevered," the matriarch observed during one of their brief rests. "The blade that wounded you, it carried our biotoxins." Kale nodded wearily. "Standard Vexori tactic. If the blade doesn't kill you, the poison will." "Not poison. An engineered microorganism," she corrected. "It is not a pleasant death." "I've seen it," Kale said flatly. "The hallucinations, the necrosis, the liquefaction of internal organs." "Yet you continue," she said, her triple gaze studying him with something that might have been curiosity. "Why expend your remaining strength carrying an enemy? You could increase your own chances of survival by leaving me." Kale had been asking himself the same question with increasing frequency as the journey grew more arduous. "Maybe I'm already hallucinating and this is all a fever dream," he said with a pained smile. "Or maybe I'm just tired of killing." Before she could respond, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted them. Except it wasn't thunder. The sound was too regular, too mechanical. Above the fungal canopy, visible through gaps in the giant caps, energy discharges illuminated gathering storm clouds. "Electromagnetic storm," the matriarch said, her tone urgent. "We must find shelter. Now." Kale knew of Xylos's infamous electrical storms. Massive weather systems charged with so much electromagnetic energy that they could fry electronics and living nervous systems alike. They were effectively death sentences for anyone caught in the open. "How long do we have?" "Minutes at most," she replied, her gaze fixed on the turbulent sky above. "There is a place, a temple ruin not far from here. My people built it millennia ago, before your kind even discovered fire. The condescension in her voice was clear, but Kale ignored it. Direction? North-northeast from here. The stone will shield us from the worst of the energies. With renewed urgency driven by survival rather than strength, Kale pressed on, following the matriarch's directions. The first fingers of electrical discharge were beginning to reach down through the fungal canopy as they finally spotted the ruins, a structure of dark, glossy stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. They reached the entrance just as the full fury of the storm broke overhead. Bolts of purple-white energy lashed the ground outside, setting several of the larger fungi ablaze with eerie, slow-burning flames. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, the ancient stone somehow insulating them from both the heat of the day and the electrical chaos outside. These walls contain energy-absorbing minerals, the matriarch explained as Kale carefully set her down on a relatively smooth section of floor. They will protect us. The interior of the ruin was a single chamber, its walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move in the dim light filtering through the entrance. Kale found himself avoiding looking directly at them, as they gave him a distinct sense of vertigo. "What is this place?" he asked, focusing instead on checking his wound. The infection was spreading visibly now, blue-black tendrils extending outward from a gash. "A place of communion," she replied. "From before the sundering, when my people still spoke with the old ones." Kale decided not to press for clarification. Vexori religious practices were notoriously incomprehensible to humans, often involving concepts that had no translation in any Terran language. As the storm raged outside, Kale's condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever spiked, sending him into alternating states of burning heat and bone-deep chills. His vision blurred, and at times he found himself confused about where he was and why. In a moment of clarity, he found the matriarch watching him with an unreadable expression. "I'm not going to make it to the outpost," he stated, his voice a dry rasp. "No," she agreed. "The biotoxin has progressed too far. Your physiological responses suggest complete system failure within 6 to 8 hours." Kale laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "At least you're honest." "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. The truth this time. Kale considered deflecting again, but found he lacked the energy for pretense. "After so much death, I wanted to save something, even if it was an enemy. Maybe especially because it was an enemy." He shuddered as another wave of pain washed through him. Proves we're not just killing machines yet. The matriarch was silent for a long moment, her 3 eyes seemingly focused on something distant. Finally, she moved, the motion clearly causing her pain, until she was beside him. "I cannot cure you," she said, "but I can slow the progression, perhaps enough to reach your outpost." Before Kale could respond, she placed her slender hands on either side of his face. Her palms were cool against his fevered skin, and a subtle vibration seemed to emanate from them. "What are you?" "Be still," she commanded. "This requires concentration." A strange sensation spread from her touch, not unpleasant, but alien, as though microscopic ice crystals were forming beneath his skin, then dissolving, taking some of the burning pain with them. "You're using psionics," he realized aloud. All Vexori possessed some degree of psychic ability, but the royal lineage was said to have powers that bordered on the supernatural. "A crude description, but essentially correct," she replied, her voice strained with effort. "I am temporarily suppressing the metabolic processes of the microorganisms, but it is difficult in my current state." After several minutes, she withdrew her hands, visibly exhausted. "That is all I can do." Kale felt markedly better, not cured, but the fever had receded, and the pain had dulled to a manageable throb. "Thank you," he said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "Consider it partial repayment for my life," she replied, "though I still fail to understand why you would value it." "Maybe there are things more important than the war," Kale suggested, surprising himself with a near-treasonous thought. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but such things rarely survive contact with those who profit from conflict." They fell silent then, listening to the storm gradually subside outside. Kale found himself wondering about the matriarch's earlier hint of betrayal within her own ranks. But exhaustion claimed him before he could frame the question, pulling him into uneasy sleep. When he awoke, the storm had passed, and pale, watery sunlight filtered through the entrance of the ruin. The matriarch was awake, her gaze fixed on the carvings that covered the walls. "You spoke of betrayal earlier," Kale said, slowly pushing himself into a sitting position. His head swam, but the worst of the fever's symptoms remained at bay. "You said something about being deliberately exposed on the battlefield." She turned to him, her expression guarded. "You remember that? I had assumed the fever had taken your faculties." "Not yet," he replied. "Was it true?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "There is a faction among my court that believes my policies toward your alliance are too measured. They prefer extermination to containment. They arrange for my guard to be diverted, leaving me vulnerable during what should have been a ceremonial appearance, not a combat situation. So they want you dead because you're not genocidal enough?" Kale asked incredulously. The matriarch's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "Politics, Corporal Kale. Not so different between our species, it seems." Kale frowned. "I never told you my rank or name." "You didn't need to," she replied simply, tapping one slender finger against her temple. "Your thoughts are loud, especially when you're fevered." That revelation should have alarmed him more than it did. But Kale found he had little energy left for paranoia. "Can you walk now? We should move." "While I still can." With effort, the matriarch rose, testing her weight on her injured limb. "Not well, but better than before," she assessed. "I heal more quickly than your kind." The journey resumed, though with a significant change. Rather than carrying the matriarch fully, Kale now supported her weight against his side, her arm across his shoulders. It was still arduously slow going, but considerably less taxing than before. They emerged from the fungal forest by midday, facing a new challenge, a vast stretch of crystalline formations rising from steaming pools of acidic liquid. The infamous acid marshes of Xylos. "We must cross here," the matriarch said, pointing to a series of crystalline islands that formed a treacherous but navigable path across the caustic expanse. "The outpost lies just beyond the northern ridge." Kale eyed the crossing dubiously. "Those crystals look sharp and unstable." "They are both," she confirmed. "But they're also the only way forward unless you wish to circle the entire marsh, a journey of many days." With no real choice, they began the crossing. Each crystal formation required careful testing before putting their full weight on it, and more than once, a seemingly solid structure crumbled beneath them, forcing desperate jumps to adjacent platforms. The acidic mist rising from the pools burned their lungs and stung their eyes, adding to the misery of the crossing. Halfway across, disaster struck. A formation collapsed as Kale stepped on it, plunging his already wounded leg knee-deep into the acid pool before he could pull himself back up. His scream echoed across the marsh as the caustic liquid ate through his pant leg and began searing his flesh. The matriarch, showing surprising strength, hauled him up onto the crystal platform, then ripped the bottom portion of her own ceremonial garment to wipe away as much of the acid as possible. "It's bad," she said, her voice tight as she examined the damage. The acid had burned away much of the skin below his knee, exposing muscle and bone in places. "Very bad." Kale bit down hard on his hand to keep from screaming again as waves of agony washed over him. The biotoxin infection seemed almost trivial compared to this new torment. "I'm done," he gasped when he could speak again. "I can't walk on this." "Then I will help you," the matriarch said with unexpected determination. "As you helped me." Before he could protest, she positioned herself under his arm, taking his weight much as he had taken hers earlier. "Why?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. "Because you showed mercy when you had no reason to," she replied simply. "And because we are both dead if we stay here." The rest of the crossing was a blur of pain for Kale. He was only dimly aware of the matriarch guiding him, supporting him, preventing him from stepping into particularly unstable formations. By the time they reached solid ground on the far side, he was barely conscious, moving on instinct and the matriarch's guidance alone. "There," she said, pointing ahead as they crested a small rise. "Your outpost." Through pain-blurred vision, Kale saw the abandoned Terran facility in the distance. It was clearly damaged. Parts of the perimeter wall had collapsed, and one of the main structures showed scorch marks from weapons fire. But it was intact enough to potentially contain what they needed. "We're going to make it," he said, almost disbelieving. "Perhaps," the matriarch replied, her tone guarded. "But I sense something is not right." Kale was in no condition to question her instincts. They continued their painful progress toward the outpost, each step an exercise in endurance for both of them. The Vexori Queen's own injuries were clearly taking their toll, her breathing becoming more labored and her steps less steady. As they approached the final stretch, a flat expanse of barren ground between them and the outpost, Kale spotted movement on the perimeter wall, a glint of metal catching the sun. "Wait," he said, pulling them both down behind a rock outcropping. "Someone's there." The matriarch narrowed her eyes, focusing. "Terrans," she confirmed after a moment. "A small group. Recently arrived, judging by the freshness of their thoughts." Kale's heart leapt. "My people. They can help. Medical treatment, evacuation. And what will they think, seeing you with me?" The matriarch asked quietly. "Will they see a hero who saved an enemy queen? Or a traitor influenced by Vexori mind control?" The question gave Kale pause. Standard Terran protocols regarding high-value Vexori captives were explicit. They were to be neutralized immediately due to the risk of psychic influence or biological contamination. And a soldier found aiding such an enemy. "I'll explain," he said, but the conviction in his voice was hollow. "They'll understand once I tell them what happened." "Will they?" Her three eyes regarded him with something that might have been pity. "Your minds are so certain of your own perceptions, so resistant to changing what you believe you know." Before Kale could respond, a new sound reached them, the distinctive hum of Vexori engines approaching from the east. "No," the matriarch whispered, genuine fear in her voice for the first time. "It's them, the usurpers. They must have tracked my psionic signature when I healed you." Kale looked back and forth between the outpost and the approaching Vexori craft, caught between two forces, both of which would likely view him as an enemy. The bitter irony of their situation wasn't lost on him. "We've come too far to give up now," he decided. "The outpost is our best chance. Your people are still too far away to intercept us if we move now. And mine, they're soldiers like me. They'll listen." The matriarch seemed unconvinced but nodded. There is no better option. With renewed urgency, they abandoned stealth for speed, making their final approach to the outpost across open ground. Kale waved his free arm, tried to signal peaceful intentions to the Terran soldiers, now clearly visible on the wall. "Alliance forces," he shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. "Corporal Kale Donovan, 33rd Frontier Battalion. I need medical assistance." The response was immediate, but not what he had hoped for. Multiple weapons trained on them. An amplified voice called back, "Halt immediately. You are in possession of a Class Alpha hostile. Release the Vexori and step away, or we will open fire." "Listen to me," Kale shouted back desperately. "She's injured. I'm escorting her as a prisoner. We need medical treatment." "Final warning," the voice responded. "Release the hostile now. This is a direct order, Corporal." Kale hesitated, looking at the matriarch. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps even a respect born of shared struggle and survival. "Go," she said softly. "Save yourself. Tell them I controlled your mind. They will believe that." "No," Kale replied firmly. "I didn't carry you 25 miles to abandon you at the doorstep. We go together, or not at all." The matriarch's expression showed surprise, then a sad resignation. "So be it. But know that I hold you in the highest honor, Corporal Kale of the Terrans. Few of any species would have shown the courage and compassion you have demonstrated." They continued forward, supporting each other, refusing to separate despite the increasingly frantic orders from the outpost wall. "We mean no harm," Kale called out one last time. "She saved my life, as I saved hers." The first shot came without further warning, a high-energy pulse that struck the ground just in front of them, sending up a spray of superheated rock and soil. A warning shot, but barely. Behind them, the sound of Vexori engines grew louder. The usurper faction's ship was closing fast, its distinctive silhouette now visible on the horizon. "Forward," Kale insisted, pulling the matriarch along. "It's our only chance." They managed another 3 steps before the Terran commander made his decision. This time, there was no warning shot. The energy bolt caught Kale square in the chest, punching through his armor with contemptuous ease. He felt a moment of searing pain, then a curious numbness as he fell backward, the matriarch's cry of alarm seeming to come from very far away. As he lay on the ground, his lifeblood pooling beneath him, he was dimly aware of the matriarch kneeling beside him, her 3 eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name. Her lips moved, but he could no longer hear the words. Above them, the Vexori ship roared into position, weapons trained not on the Terrans, but on their own queen. The usurpers had arrived, ready to complete their coup by eliminating both the matriarch and the human who had saved her. In his final moments of consciousness, Kale was struck by the bitter irony of all. He had carried a wounded enemy queen 25 miles through one of the most hostile environments in known space, surviving against impossible odds, only to be killed by his own people at the threshold of safety. His reward for compassion, for refusing to succumb to the hatred that drove the war, was death. As darkness closed in, his last sight was of the matriarch being roughly seized by Terran soldiers, her 3 eyes still fixed on him, a silent witness to the final cost of his mercy. The war would continue. The hatred would persist. And the singular act of humanity in the midst of inhuman conflict would be crushed beneath the machinery of war and suspicion, forgotten by all save one alien queen who had glimpsed, if only briefly, the possibility of something better.